And I'd like to begin our prayer together today in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So one of the things right from the beginning in these first couple verses where he says, who was with him when they got into the boat? You know, these Thomas, who is that the one who was doubting in just the previous story. Nathanael, Cana in Galilee. And you notice that some of these are unnamed, two others of the disciples. So in some ways, I think from the beginning, I think there's an invitation to know that the exact number of people and the exact identities of the people isn't necessarily the most important thing of this story. It's not unimportant, but it's not the most important. And one other thing I'd like to point out right there is, it says, so the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And I bring that up here to say that a lot of scripture scholars debate who the character of John, the disciple who Jesus loved, was. And in John's gospel, one very strong argument is made that whenever we read, so the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, that it's actually an invitation for the reader, that John, the writer of John's gospel, knew even back then when it was written, that this could be an invitation for us, for any Christian who believes in Jesus, to put ourselves in the story. And so maybe just think about that in the back of your head, that in some ways, each of us is at this scene, if you will, that when when the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord," we could almost read that as saying that we're saying that to Simon Peter. So just something to consider from anytime you read something in John's gospel, that when you read the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's you, that's me, that's us. I think that's a beautiful invitation. So Simon Peter says to them, "I'm going fishing." And I love this. I don't know about you, but I even love that. Maybe you've even known somebody like, "I'm going fishing." Or then maybe you know someone else that just has their version of "I'm going fishing." Sometimes it means I'm going to go do something I love to do. And sometimes it means that come with me. And sometimes it means that I don't want anyone near me. I'm going out. Sometimes it can be one of these things where we have our releases, we have our, and it's a really beautiful thing, actually. Fishing in this way was something that Peter knew how to do. He was really good at, made his living at. It's an old friend, if you will. And so he's going to do something. I think so many of us have that inclination to go back to the things that work. And because he's a leader in his own right, people are like, "Well, we're coming too." It's like he named something for them maybe as well. And because there's nothing in here that gives us a sense that he turned them away, they all get in the boat. He maybe invited the company. Maybe he was happy that there were other people that felt like that. You can imagine these guys kind of not really realizing what's going on. They're so confused, even though Jesus has come to them a couple times. There they are. And I think there's definitely an invitation for us to consider the times in our lives where there don't seem to be any slam dunks. We seem as confused as these guys are. And so I'm going to go down to, and when Peter finally realized that it was Jesus on the shore, he got so excited. I love this scene also. Again, so easy to imagine. If you're an imaginative person, if that's the way you pray, if you can put yourself in a scene and imagine yourself in it, this is a great gospel to pray with, because you can see it's so descriptive. And you can see how excited he is, this leader who kind of called these guys together, when he finally realizes who is on the shore. He's like beside himself. This idea that he took off all his clothes and he jumped in. I love it. And it's hilarious to me too, just on a side note, that they say they're only like 100 yards from shore. They really weren't that far. I mean, who knows if he was even swimming at that point? He's probably up to his waist. But that's how excited he is to see Jesus again. And this net that has been thrown in the sea, kind of like that story we heard from Luke 5, it's so full. And they're dragging this thing. But this is the other part I love. Jesus is ready for him. He's on the shore already. He is the ultimate party planner. He's got the coals hot. He's got some fish on it already. He's ready to eat. He's going potluck style. He's like, I got the first round. You guys, let's bring your fish in and see what you got. And it gives them an invitation to share in what he brings to the table. And I think that's the invitation. That's Eucharist. I don't know about you, but I had to learn as a little kid that when we come to church, it's not just about me. It's not just about my thing. Eucharist, the table, church is about us. And I think my parents in particular, my mom used to say to me, she's like, what are you bringing? Like, why you can't just show up and expect everyone to cook everything for you and bring everything for you? What are you bringing? I think that's a good thing to remember. I think this little part of the story reminds us of that. Jesus says, hey, I'll get it started, but what are you bringing? And I think that's an invitation for us to ask ourselves what we bring into this Jesus who loves us, but also to our families or to ourselves, maybe to our own spirit. Maybe what you're bringing today is a spirit of peace, and that's what you need. It's just that simple, and allow it to be that simple. So there's this question about the 153 large fish. I thought I would just speak to that because it is a thing in the tradition, but also might just be something that you even thought of today. What is the significance of saying, because we hear a lot of numbers. We hear 12, we hear 3, we hear 7, we hear 70 times 7. We hear these types of numbers, but specific numbers like 153 don't always come up. And so I think for good reason, people are curious about it. And so here's just a couple of ideas from the tradition. Like St. Augustine, he believed that these ideas of 7 and 10s and 17. So when they're all added together, it equals 153. So it's like 10 plus 7 is 17. And if all those numbers from 1 to 17 are added together, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then it all equals up to 153. And so he said that's probably what was meant by this 153. So a numbers thing. And so then St. Cyril and Methodius, if you've ever heard of those names, we celebrate them in the liturgical calendar. They were brothers, they taught in what is probably now Eastern Europe, more or less. They also had an idea of this number. If you take the number 100 of 153, the multitude of married lay faithful in the church, plus 50, which is the many faithful who commit themselves later in life. So maybe in living with their spouse in a brother or sister relationship. So anyway, that's a life of commitment. Plus 3, which is the few people who will live their life in a vow of celibacy, like nuns or priests do. If you take that 100, which is the most, and the 50, who's some, like maybe we'll say that single vocation, and then the 3, which is very few, but some do, are monks and priests and nuns, well, then that equals 153, 153. So that's the whole church. That was his theory. And St. Jerome thought that at the time in the world, there were only 153 species of fish. So that's what he thought, that what's being taught here is that Jesus brought in 150, or the disciples brought in 153 fish. That's every type of person on earth, the gospel's for everybody. I think also a good theory. And so even Pythagoras had a theory that had to do with numbers. He's the Pythagorean theorem guy. All of these numbers. And at the end of the day, I think it's good to say that these are all theories and they're all interesting. And I think we could go with a biblical scholar who's very well respected named Raymond Brown. And he's the one that's written a lot on this. And he says, at the end of the day, we actually can't prove any of these theories correct. So it's not, the point of the story isn't to be caught up in what the number exactly means. The point of the story is that we realize that Jesus is trying to tell us a deeper message, a deeper spiritual message in this story. Just because we can't prove it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. But just because we can't prove it doesn't mean we need to get stuck there either. And so I think when Jesus says in that, what is it, the 12th verse, I love this. I wish I was teaching high school right now, because I would definitely use this verse with my high school kids. But when he says, come have breakfast, I already knew breakfast was my favorite meal of the day. But now I have some scriptural support for it. I've seen the reading, I've heard the reading, but I never realized that it was in there. So come have breakfast. And I think that's the bigger point Jesus is trying to make to us, and that John's gospel is trying to make today, is that we're asked to come and eat. We're asked to bring what we have with us, wherever we come from, whoever we are. We're asked to come have breakfast. That some of the table's going to be set by God. Things in our lives, some things are set, like we know. And what are we bringing then with Jesus to come have breakfast? And how can we meet Jesus like the apostles did on the side of the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias as it's called? How can we be people who are ready to meet him as imperfect as we are, like Peter was? Because Jesus is going to make it right. We see it happen. We know what's coming next. Or are we people who are not the one who came up with the idea, but we know the direction to go in, like the disciples who joined Peter? What are we bringing today to this Jesus, to this time that we live in, to the people around us? I think that's the invitation of this reading. As I prayed with it, to remember that we are loved in this way very deeply, and that we will be sustained. And I think that's what I can take a lot of great hope in from this reading, is that this isn't just about coming and being there, which is very important, but it's also remembering that this is sustenance, and that if I can get myself the courage to share this with other people, it will help them also be sustained. And that gives me a lot of hope. Like you're asking, like, what do you do on the south side of Chicago right now in this time?
Yeah.
I think is an excellent question. And I think part of our reality is that we are sheltered in place, right? We are physically being asked to stay in our homes. And again, I think the constant reminder here is to say that it's good medical advice, what we're doing. And to remember that, like from the very beginning, people said, if you want to save somebody's life, stay at home. It's like the doctors and nurses who are in hospitals caring for people are saying, we don't need you here. We don't need you sick in our face right now. We need you home. And that's something we can do to keep ourselves safe, but I think a lot of other people. And then if we do happen to get sick, these things happen. It's that we could keep the numbers low. And so some of what we're being asked to do is to stay in the upper room, if you will. On some level, we're asked to be there. Am I right? And we know, though, that an upper room is not a sealed container. You know, our houses are not sealed. Like we see even in the readings that preceded this in John, that Jesus came into the space, came through the wall. And I think there's an invitation for us to remember that as we're sheltered in our homes on the south side of Chicago, wherever we might find ourselves today, that we are not alone. And it might feel that way, and sometimes it is that way, but we are not alone on that deep spiritual level. And I think it's an invitation also to know that even in the upper room, the problem the disciples had wasn't that they were there and gathered or that they were safe. That's not the problem. The problem is what they weren't allowing Jesus to be in the center of that upper room, if you will. And so the problem isn't for us to be sheltered in place. I mean, it's got its limitations. I don't mean to make it, I don't want to sound trite. I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of what we're experiencing. I'm just trying to draw out the bigger point of the fact that if we put Jesus in the center of our lives right now, some days, Philip, it looks as simple as what we're doing right now. Let's not forget that what we're doing is a great thing. Meeting at noon. I mean, I'm on the other side of the country right now. Like, what a beautiful thing to be able to share in together as community, to lift each other up and to pray for each other, pray with each other. I mean, that's a gift that we can't forget. And the fact that St. Benedict the African in particular has been so strong on the Zoom end, you know, with masses and things. I mean, it's definitely not how we want. We'd rather just be together and gathering. That's how we'd like it to be. And that's really how it should be. But that's not how it is right now. But that doesn't mean we have to forget that Jesus is in the center of our upper rooms, whether that's interior or that's our very home. And I think there are invitations beyond just this Friday Zoom and even the whole series that St. Benedict the African is doing. I think that each of us in our home, there's a good chance other people are in our spaces, that we're sheltered in place with community, our family, most likely. Maybe there's an invitation to do with Jesus something for the people in our space. Maybe something like when Peter led, he's like, you know, this is what I need right now. It could be exactly what the other people in your little space need right now as well. They just needed an idea that they didn't. You're the one with the idea. They didn't have it, but that's something we can share. You feel me? And I think that's sometimes, I think what we have to think sometimes right now, because it's such a specific period of time, is that some of what we need to do is so small. And I think there's an invitation as well to be right now and not always to do, because I think there's a lot that can be done and is being done. But we'll know that what to do when we hear it from God. We know it because we felt it before. But sometimes the invitation at this time is also to be, to breathe, to sit with peace and to feel love, because that's what we'll start giving off. But if we don't take the time to be, we might miss Jesus coming into our very midst. But if he needs to, he'll walk through a wall. So we got that going for us. But let's not forget to take the little moments, the littlest of little moments, to be with Jesus. And to remember, it might not actually mean acting in any big way. It might just mean receiving.